Hey, and welcome back to the Dad Who Codes. So this is video 2 of the to-do list, and just to go over our code again, we have a create to-do function which outputs a console log message. This create to-do function is called from a button with an on-click event to that function, which calls the console.log hello from script.js file. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to clean up some of the code. So I'm going to delete some of the comments from the code. So we don't need 4a, and I'm just going to rename this to 4b. We're also going to delete comments 1, 2, and 3b. And we're also going to delete comment 3a and put a space between the URL element and the button. We're also going to remove the console.log that we had in our create to do function. This create to do function needs to create the list element for the URL element. And what we need to do is we need to be able to find this URL element which has an ID called Todolist. And the way that we're going to do it is using the document.getElementByID function. So what is the document.getElementByID function? Well, the document refers to the web page that's loaded in our browser. So in our case, this is the to-do list page that we have loaded in Replit browser. The document has a method called getElementByID, and what that does is it looks into our document and finds a specific ID, and then it returns that element. So in our case, we have an ID called Todolist. So if we pass in a parameter that's a string called Todolist, that should help us find the URL element. Of note, you can only have one ID in a document, so you wouldn't be able to use ID equals Todolist in another HTML element. So the final code should look something like this, where we use the document.getElementByID, open brackets, quotation mark, Todolist, in order to get our URL element. Once we've found the element, we make sure in JavaScript that we set this to a variable. So now back to our code. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a variable, as I mentioned, and I'm just going to call this to-do list element. And remember, we need to set this to the element in our document based on the ID of to-do list. And I've got a quick quiz for you. I want you to use the document.getElementByID in order to find URL element with the ID to-do list. So give it a quick try now, and I'll show you my solution. Okay, so what I would do is say document.getElementByID, open parentheses, and let's double check what the ID is called, and it's called to-do list. So I'm going to open a quotation mark and put in to-do list. So let's check quickly that this works. We're going to console.log out to-do list element, which is that variable. And now when we run the Replit application and we look at our console log, we can see that we've got our URL element with the ID to-do list. Okay, so the next thing to do is we're going to delete the console.log. And to go over the code again, what we need to do is, to the variable to-do list element, we're going to be adding our li elements to it. So how is this going to work? This is what it looks like with the UL element, and every time we create a to-do, we're going to add an li element to it. So there's the first one, angular brackets li, close the angular brackets, and that's going to help us create the li's. What's important to note is that in the JavaScript file, we do need to pass in a string representation of the HTML element. So what you'll see is that in JavaScript, we will use the apostrophes, open the angular brackets, li, close the angular brackets, to create a string representation of the HTML. So in order to attach HTML content to the to-do list element variable, we're going to have to use a function called insertAdjacentHTML. So what is the insertAdjacentHTML function? Well, this function is found on the element interface. And what that means in our case is that this is found on the URL element with the ID of to-do list. What's important to note is that this function, it takes two parameters, a position and the HTML content. Now the position is basically where your new HTML content is going to appear onto, in our case, the UL element. And there are 4 positions that it can be placed into. The HTML contents is the new content that you want to add to a specific element. So in my case, it's going to be the LI elements, the to-do list that I want to add to my UL element. So I've just opened up a different replit just to show you how this code works. What we have in this piece of code is a UL element with an ID called element, and it just has the word an element in it. There's a script tag that attaches to the JavaScript, and I've just commented out 4 pieces of code for this JavaScript. Each piece of code is basically adding to the UL element a new piece of HTML content. And as I mentioned in the PowerPoint quickly, there are 4 positions where your new HTML content can go to. There is the before begin, after begin, before end, and after end. So let's have a look what the before begin looks like when we uncomment that code. And you can see it appears before the UL element. So let's have a look at what the after begin does. And what we can see here is that it also appears before the URL element, but it actually just appears above it. So what's happening? If I open up the link in the browser and I hit the F12 button on my Windows laptop, we can actually see an HTML representation of that document. And what we can see is that the before begin actually lies outside of the URL element, and the after begin just appears within that URL element, but just before that string that I have with the an element. And this is really interesting to know because we can have a think about where the before end should lie. So just have a guess, where do you think the before end position will be? I'll give you a couple of seconds. Okay, so it's just a quick guess. Let's just see what happens when we uncomment the code and we run the application again. You can see it appears just after the an element, but before it ends. So let me just refresh the browser as I go back to it. And I just open up the URL element, and you can see that it's still within the URL element, but just before it ends. So one more thing is we're going to just see what the after end does. So you can have a quick guess of where it's going to lie, and we can see it just arrives at the end. So in my code, the best position for me to use will be the before end. And I'll just show you quickly when I run the application again. And this is because I want my to-do list LI elements to appear within my URL elements and build beneath each other as they go along. So let's try and get that to work in our code. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to remove the code I just put in just now for the insertAdjacentHTML and the to-do list, adding the li. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable called content. And this is essentially our HTML content that we want to appear within that UL element, the variable that I have above this, the to-do list element. And again, as I mentioned before, when we add the HTML content, we need to wrap it in a string when we have it written in JavaScript. So what I'm going to do is open angular brackets li, close it, open the angular brackets again with a /li and close it. And between this, what I want is an input tag. I want everything to look a bit clearer, so I'm just going to hit the return button so that the li, the input, and the li, closing li, appear on their own lines. And what you'll see is the code seems to break. And what's happening is that we're not concatenating these strings. So what I'm going to do is make sure that each element that's on its own line is surrounded by quotation marks, and then I'm going to put a plus sign on each one. Okay, that looks to fix things up, so the code looks a lot better now. And what we're going to do is, again, we need to make a text input. So what we have to do is put in type, and we have to go equals, and open apostrophe text, so that it knows that it is text input. Then we need to give it a value, which I'm going to set it to an empty string. And I want to give it a placeholder as well. This is the text that you see in the text input that just gives you a hint as to what it's going to do. And I'm going to put in enter a to do. Next, we need to use the insertAdjacentHTML function. We're going to call the to-do list element that we used before from the document.getElementByID function dot insertAdjacentHTML, and then open the parentheses, close parentheses. It takes two parameters. One is the position, and we're going to be using before end with the apostrophes. And then we're going to be passing in the HTML code, which in our case is the variable content that we have above. Put in this semicolon, and let's run the Replit application again. And when we click on the Add to Do button, you can see that the LI element does come up. But it does look a bit weird with that dot at the beginning. So I'm just going to open up my style sheet, and we can see that there should be a style that is attached to the ID to-do list. Now I have made a mistake here. I'm using a capital L for the list when it should be a lowercase l. And that's very important, again, as I mentioned before, that IDs are unique. So what I'm going to do in my style sheet is that I'm going to change the capital L to a lowercase l, and then run the application again. I'm going to click the Add to Do button, and you can see we create a new to-do list without that dot at the beginning. Now continuing with our code, we also need our two buttons, the completed button and the delete button. And they're going to appear just below the input element. So I'm just going to create some space for it. But I'm going to give this a quick quiz for you to do as well. I want you to create a button for the complete button, and I want you to create a button for the delete button. So give it a try now, and I'll show you how I do it. Okay, so all we have to do is open angular brackets, type in button and close the angular brackets. And because I'm just writing HTML code, Replit does auto create the closing button for me. And I'm just going to put in complete between these tags and make sure I wrap this within quotation marks. I'm going to add a plus button so that it concatenates as I create a new line. Open the quotation mark, opening angular bracket, button, close angular bracket, open angular brackets again, / button, close angular brackets. And then this is called delete. And I'm going to make sure I put the plus button at the end so that it concatenates. So this is one large HTML string. And then we're going to reload the application. And we're going to hit the Add to Do button. And we can see that the text input and the complete and delete buttons do get created. So just a quick recap on what we've done today. We've used the document.getElementByID function in order to find the element with an ID called Todolist, which is our UL element. We then set what we find to a variable called Todolist element. We then create an HTML content, which is the to-do list, as a list element. And this contains the list element, the input text element, and the two buttons complete and delete. And we set this string to a variable called content. We then go back to the to-do list element and we call the insertAdjacentHTML function to pass a position where we're going to say before the end, and then we're going to pass the HTML content into that position. And this is all part of the create-to-do function, so that when we click on the Add to Do button, it creates a new to-do list for us based on this HTML content here. And so as a final recap, we use the getElementByID in order to find an HTML element by its ID. In our case, we found the UL element by the ID to-do list. We then use the inner adjacent HTML on the output of what we found with the getElementByID in order to attach HTML content via JavaScript to a position of our choice. We use the inner adjacent HTML so that it doesn't reset existing HTML content. You can actually try a different method that does a similar thing called inner HTML just to see what I mean. And with that, that's the end of part 2. And we'll be continuing with the to-do list tutorial in part 3, which will be found in the description below. So, see you next time.